want to just take a few minutes and introduce the idea of iterations. This stuff is in the ICT PDF that's in Canvas, chapter 12. We're not covering everything in there. We're only covering 2 types of loops, maybe 3 if you think of it that way. But so be very careful about all the stuff in chapter 12. So basically, what I mean by iterations or iterative code, it's coding that repeats until the process is done. It repeats until you're told to stop. You're told to stop when the task is complete. So told to stop when the task is complete. Okay. There are 2 types of loops that we're going to focus in on. There's other types, but we are only going to focus on while loops and for loops. Now, there are 2 types of for loops. We're only going to look at one of them for the time being, and then later on I'll introduce the other type. There's really no difference between a while loop and a for loop. You can usually make them both work. However, typically a while loop is used when we don't know how many times we're going to do the iterations. So we have an unknown number. And of course, then the for loop is best when we have a known number of iterations. Again, you can make both work under either case. This is just, it's an easier application. When we don't know how many iterations, the while loop is an easier application than the for loop. So I'm gonna take a few minutes and look at some of the general characteristics for iterations for while and for loops, and then look more specifically at the setup for the while and for loop, and then I'm going to pull up some code and some example codes for each one to kind of talk you through. So here's some general information that apply to both loops. They both execute as long as they both have a conditional. And as long as the conditional is true, they execute. Or, so they execute when the conditional is true, or it's terminated, or the method is terminated with a return statement. So you could have a return statement inside the loop. If you have a return statement inside the loop, perfectly fine. As soon as that return statement executes, the loop stops executing, the entire method stops executing. So, but it's usually the conditional must be true. When the conditional is false, the loop does not execute. A little bit like an if-then statement, a little bit like an if statement. You know, if the conditional is false, then the statements in the if don't execute. Loop doesn't execute. All right. The condition must become false. You've got to stop the loop at some time. Must. And so that's sometimes the care. If it doesn't and the loop never stops, then that's what we call an infinite loop. There are 2 ways to control the loop. We can have either a loop control variable, which is usually a number or something, or we can have what's called a sentinel. A sentinel is a keyword, so to speak, or it could be a number. Like in Magpie, the sentinel is by. And so we'll look at this example later on. Usually we use a sentinel with a while loop. The loop control variable can be used with either a while. It's basically always used with a for loop, but it can be used either one. If in general, and here's where you have to be careful, variables, loop control variables, any other variables need to be declared and initialized before entering the loop. I apologize if this is getting hard to read. Initialized. If you initialize a variable inside the loop, if you declare a variable inside the loop, every time that loop executes, you're redeclaring the variable and you're basically resetting it. So variables, as they go into the loop, that are used in the loop, need to be declared and given some value before the loop. There may be limited exceptions to this. This is not a hard, fast rule, but it's pretty close. Let's take a quick look at the format and the structure of a while loop. So while loops execute while the conditional is true. And so the basic structure is we have our keyword while, and then inside the parentheses we have our conditional, our Boolean expression. Same idea as with if statements. While this condition is true, these steps execute. Somewhere in these steps, and it's typically at the end, it doesn't have to be, but it typically is, there needs to be something to change the loop control variable, or we enter the sentinel value. We need to do something inside the loop that will eventually, at some point, cause this conditional to be false. If we don't, we have an infinite loop. As I said before, if we're using the loop control variable, it's got to be initialized up here. So using the loop control variable, I might say something like int I is 0. In here, I would say I is I plus 1. Another way of saying this is I plus plus. And then our conditional might be as long as I is less than or equal to 10, maybe, something like that. And then this loop will execute so many times. This is kind of interesting. If our initial value for I is 10, it'll be less than or equal to 10. It'll execute, it becomes 11. If our initial value for I is 20, the conditional is false to begin with, the loop doesn't execute at all. We run into that. Sometimes the loop will not execute at all, and that might be the purpose of our code. And so that's okay. Let me take a look. Now I want to look at the structure of a for loop real quick. I said earlier, there's two types of for loops. We're going to focus on what I just refer to it as the normal for loop, the regular for loop. We'll look at the other type later on. So with a regular for loop, there are three parts to it. We have to initialize the loop control variable. I said it needs to be done before the loop. In the for loop, it's done at the beginning. We have our conditional statement. These are semicolons, so it's we declare and initialize our loop control variable, semicolon, our conditional, semicolon, and then we change our loop control variable. And then we have our code. Yeah, you can't see the curly brace very well. The lines of code, and then the end of our loop. So let me explain how the for loop executes. As we enter the loop, this is done first. We give our loop control variable, we declare it, we give it an initial value. We then check it against the conditional. If this statement is true, we execute the loop. When we get done with the loop, we change the loop control variable. Check it with the conditional. If it's true, we continue. As soon as this conditional is false, we continue the rest of the code outside the loop. So the structure looks, I don't know, maybe a little odd, but it's very nice. I would say we use for loops much more than while loops. So what I want to do now is I'm going to pull up some examples of code with both the while and the for loop, and I want to talk you through them for just a second.
Okay, let's take a couple looks at some example of while and for loops. This is from the Magpie runner class that we're just finished looking at. This is the runner that's provided for you, and here's the scanner object. This is typing in the information. Statement is whatever you type in as part of the chatbot. As soon as you type it in, you enter this while loop, and this loop executes as long as the statement is not equal to by. And then if it's not equal to by, then we go and we call the get response, passing that statement in. You type in another line, and then the while loop comes back up to here. And so in this case, by is our sentinel. And here's the line where we are basically changing our conditional. Every loop you have to change the conditional somehow. And so as soon as you type in by, capital B-Y-E, this conditional becomes false, and we kick out of the loop. So that's an example of a while loop with a sentinel. Here's a little code that I wrote last night. I'm declaring I, initializing it to 0. We enter our while loop, and I'm just going to print out I. Here's where I'm incrementing it. So I'm using I as my loop control variable. And so there's where I'm incrementing it. And as long as it's less than or equal to 10, we will print out I. Down here, I have an example of a for loop. I'm initializing and declaring j as 0. As long as j is less than 10, we're going to print out j, and here's where I increment. So let's just run this real quick, and it shouldn't be too shocking, but I want to show some other things that can occur. And shocking, there it is. I stopped my for loop with j less than 10, so I didn't print out 10. Let's say I is 20, and I compile it, and I run it. And so here my while loop doesn't execute at all. Nothing is printed out. This is all my for loop information. Let's type in this real quick. Let's get out of the while after the while loop. System.out.println I is equal to, and So let's print the value of I after the while loop, and let's print the value of J after the for loop. Let's see until I can't type. There. So I'm printing I after the while loop. When the so I'm printing the value of Y after the while loop finishes executing, and I'm going to print the value of J after the for loop finishes executing. We're going to hit compile. We have an error because it can't find that symbol. Here's the thing. When we declare our loop control variable as part of our for loop header, the scope of that variable is only inside the for loop. After the for loop, it has no value. The while loop, for example, though, I declared I before the while loop, it still has value outside the while loop. I is equal to 11. Fine. So a couple of examples of while loops and for loops with both using a loop control variable and in this case the sentinel.